Hello, my name is Jacob Cropper, and this is my 5 to 7 minute lecture on the governance of classical Islam. More specifically, the beginning of the Islamic movement by Muhammad up until the Abbasid Caliphate that we learned about in this last section. So I first wanted to start with kind of how things were decided at the beginning of the movement. After Muhammad had his visions and started getting followers and had to flee from Mecca to Medina and then came back and took over Mecca, he had quite the support group. He had quite power at that point, and so he was essentially in charge of everything. He made political decisions about where to go, where to move troops, what to do, who to appoint to positions of power, and more specifically on the doctrine of the church, the interpretation of the Quran. People had questions, they would ask him, and he would interpret it, which makes sense since he's the one who translated it or was given the visions. So, but after he died, that security, that question for doctrine, decisions was up for grabs. We didn't really know who was in charge. And so, because of that disagreement, there's disagreement over who the following leader should be. There's a little bit of a balance of powers. I'm not going to go as far to say checks and balances like the U.S. government has, but a sort of similar idea where the Caliph, the leader of the Islamic Empire, had power to make political decisions such as appointments, troop movements, other things of that nature, who's in charge, where cities should be built, how much money should go to such things, financial obligations. And then there was a class of scholars that was in charge of interpreting the doctrine, things to do with the church, who's in charge of the church. And so that was kind of how that worked up until the revolution where the Abbasids kind of took control of the Islamic Empire. Because after that, we learned in this section that the Caliph had most of the control. They really got to decide everything. There's a point in here in the When Baghdad Ruled the World, part of the Hugh Kennedy book, the chapter, A Landscape with Palaces, he says that he planned his new city on a large scale and he was in charge of the finances completely. I thought that was interesting, that he could put as much money as he wanted from their conquests, taking over Persia and some of the Ottoman Empire, because it got quite powerful. He used that to create his capital in Baghdad. And then another caliph later moved the capital to, I can't remember the city name now, Samarra. And then it eventually got moved back to Baghdad by another caliph. So it just goes to show that the caliph had ultimate power. He could do whatever he wanted, and if he took the city from one city to another, people in that city were just kind of sunk because they lost all their economic power, they lost all their control over their way of life, and they didn't have the religious leaders that they used to have. And so it's interesting to see the transition from the beginning, where it was mostly Muhammad, because he was the founder and the leader, and he kind of got to determine how it was done, to after that not really knowing what to do. So there were scholars and political leaders, and they had a big disagreement over who was really in charge, back to the caliph being the real in charge person, who decided where money went, decided how the city was run. However, as we learned, if the people didn't like how the caliph was doing things, they could revolt. And that's what happened with the Abbasid family, is the leader before them they didn't like, and so there was a revolution. And because of that revolution, then his name, all of those Abbasid emperors were able to be put in power, and they were given more complete control because it almost ended up like a dictatorship, instead of the checks and balances that they had earlier. So I thought that was really interesting, to learn about, the governance and how it changed over time, because it wasn't stagnant. It didn't stay the same the whole time. There were major differences between time periods, between who was in charge, which family kind of was in charge, which section, whether it was the Shia or the Sunni. We kind of think of the Islamic Empire as one solid time frame from when Muhammad until the fall, when the Mongols sacked Baghdad. But there were a lot of different families that were in charge. It was not the same all around. It was not the same thing throughout. So I thought that was very interesting. And this was my lecture on the governance of classical Islam, from the time of Muhammad up until the Abbasid Empire.